Requesting everyone to be seated. We will be starting in a minute. A very good evening to all present here with us today. The Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, are delighted to host you for discussions on operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund with equity and efficacy. Yesterday, countries reached agreements on setting up the Loss and Damage Fund to help countries deal with the impacts of climate breakdown, something that had long been a sticking point in negotiations. This event seeks to explore the various challenges involved in the establishment and operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund from three different perspectives: the political, financial, and scientific challenges that would need to be addressed for an effective loss and damage fund. Beyond highlighting these challenges, the event would aim to discuss solutions and a potential roadmap for the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund in an inclusive and equitable manner that can aid developing countries in addressing the emerging and increasing adverse impacts of climate change. We begin our session with a welcome address from Ms. Suruchi Bhadwal, Senior Fellow and Program Director, Earth Science and Climate Change Division, TERI. Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us here today. It's a very short welcome. I would say we are already running short of time. First and foremost, I think we would like to acknowledge the creation of a loss and damage fund, which was done last year at COP27. And of course, we see this as a substantial achievement for many countries who are experiencing the worst of impacts that basically are being observed world over. And of course, many of them are highly vulnerable and lack the capacities to be able to respond to these risks that we are talking about. The primary objective of the fund, therefore, the thought behind it was to support these countries that are exposed to the risks of climate change on one hand and are experiencing these losses, but are incapable in terms of having an effective response mechanism around it to be able to address the related concerns. The reason to hold an event on the loss and damage fund, of course, is strategic. We do know that this particular COP is supposed to get into further more details with regards to the fleshing out of what the fund would be, what would be the contours, what would be the, the muscles around the skeleton, if I were to say, with regards to the fund. Now, we do understand that it is very important to understand how this fund would basically be shaping up, what would be the structure of this fund. We do acknowledge and congratulate the UAE presidency with regards to the approval of the fund and the initial commitments made by countries for the implementation of this fund. How will it get distributed, etc.? Those details still have to be worked out, but still, there has been some commitment, and yesterday with the approval of the fund in the plenary, I think this has been a significant achievement. But we do realize that we still have a long way to go with regards to defining the nuts and bolts of the operationalization of this fund. What will be the institutional structure, mechanism around this fund, the governance around this fund, etc. And then, of course, there would be issues with regards to the access and availability of the fund and the equity dimensions that surround the fund. If we basically leave the governance part of it aside, which is still to be, framed, I think there's a lot also to understand on the scientific side. And we have with us experts from NCAR who will help us understand if this fund were to move forward, what are the different elements we can think about on the loss and damage side, scientifically speaking, and how can we basically define loss and damage per se, basis which maybe the negotiators and the policymakers can take the discussion forward with regard to its governance and the institutional mechanism surrounding it. And with that, I would just basically welcome you all again and leave it to the experts to give us a good discussion with regards to the various issues surrounding the fund. Thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We will now hear from Ms. Christine Shields, scientist at the Climate and Global Dynamics Lab with NCAR, on a presentation on the scientific and technical challenges around loss and damage.
Thank you. Can I get the slides up? So I'd like to thank everyone for being here at the site event and thank TERI for organizing. There we go. So today I'm going to talk about science informing loss and damage. This is a very broad brush sort of overview of the types of issues we need to think about scientifically for loss and damage. And I want to acknowledge the NCAR team who helped me put this together. Alexandra, Suda, and Ronnie are here in the front row. You'll meet Ronnie in a minute on the panel. And then Mari, Peter, Kim, and Linda, some of which are actually joining us online. So we are, as you heard, from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And so this is just sort of an introductory slide to tell you a little bit about what we do at NCAR. We do a mix of fundamental and applied research. And we focus on these main areas that you see up here. So weather, water, climate, air quality, sun, and space weather. So this next slide is just to talk about, oops, do I need to get, okay, I'm sorry. I hope you guys heard the first part, right? So this is a little bit of an overview of science informing loss and damage. This is very broad. So the main thing we want to think about are climate extremes. So what is going to change? How these climate extremes going to change as we move into the future? I put this image of Tropical Cyclone Tej up here as an example. This was actually in the Arabian Sea on October 24th earlier this year. And this area of the world doesn't really see a lot of tropical cyclones, and so one of the things we may expect as we move into the future is seeing more of these types of extreme events. So how do we actually understand these climate extremes in terms of attributing them to climate change? We have tools that we use, and so this is this next bullet point. We have data, we have models, we use statistics, and observations. And all of these things sort of we meld together to try to understand attribution. And then, of course, there's challenges, which I will go into in the next few slides. So I want to delve a little bit deeper into detection and attribution, because this is a primary tool that we use to try to figure out if an extreme event actually has a climate fingerprint on it. There is this, I've highlighted this new paper here. Oops. Can't get the laser pointer to work, but Noy et al. This was actually just published in Nature Climate Change just a couple weeks ago. And they argue that the event attribution is ready to inform loss and damage. And I would actually encourage you to actually look at this paper. But I wanted to sort of pull out just what they call the big four: drought, tropical cyclones, extreme precipitation, and heat waves. These are the main things that we try to do when we detect and attribute these types of events to climate change. Drought and heat waves tend to be a little bit easier with less challenges. These are broader types of topics. They're what we call synoptics, which are large-scale weather systems. Tropical cyclones and extreme precipitation is a little more challenging because these have higher fidelity, and they're harder to actually get correct, especially with limited observations. All right, so this I'm now going a little bit deeper. This is an example of a detection and attribution study by the World Weather Attribution Group. This was done by Otto et al. Earlier this year. And this is trying to attribute the Pakistani floods of last year to climate change. And so I like this paper as an example of a multi-pronged method to actually try to figure out if this actually had a climate signal. And so they use these 4 bullet points, which they've published on a number of different papers. One is called, one is I have it outlined trend calculations from observations, which is sort of technical words for just basically glorified statistics from looking at observations. Model validation, and what I mean by model is we have simulations of the Earth, whether or not, when we try to validate them, whether or not they're accurate or they're not accurate, where they are correct and where they are wrong. And then they use multi-methods and multi-models and synthesize all this information to come up with a conclusion of, yes, based on all of these things, we find a climate change signal. So these figures on the right are 2 pulses of the Pakistani floods, 2 different pulses last summer. The blues are just the deeper blues are just the more extreme precipitation, and those red outlines show the different regions. So I actually wanted to put in a plug for an event that's happening Monday, December 11th, in one of these side event rooms. There's actually going to be another extreme weather attribution put on by Climate Central, I believe. So if you're interested in that, you may actually want to check this out as well. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into the Pakistani floods of 2022. And this slide was put together by a postdoc that we work with in NCAR, Samar Minala, and she has worked on this a little bit, so I've just pulled this information from some of her work. And she asks 4 main questions, which I think sort of demonstrate or illustrate the challenges we see with these types of DNA or detection attribution problems. So the first is, can climate models reproduce precipitation trends, spatial patterns, rainfall intensities at a basin scale? So, is the model fit for purpose? 2, how can we adapt and use climate models for attribution studies? So, what's the framework, and is it adaptable from one situation to a different situation? What is the likelihood of such extreme events under various climate scenarios? So, as we move into the future, these different, how our climate evolves, we may need to adapt how we do these types of studies. So it's important to understand or to have a system that's adaptable. And then finally, from the event to the peer review process takes a lot of time. And so in the scientific world, we have peer review that we do, and this usually takes over a year to publish, and it's just a very long timeline, sometimes even longer. So is the timeline that we use for science publications compatible with the policy that we need? And the World Attribution Project actually tries to speed things up a little bit, but still the process is actually quite slow. So here I've just sort of blocked out what I summarized these main points that I thought were our major challenges, model biases, but not also model biases, but also lack of observations also is sort of included in there. Common framework, as I mentioned before, and then adaptability of this framework, and then finally the timeline needs. And then that on the box over to the left, I sort of put the idea of this higher fidelity models is always a little bit of a challenge, especially for these higher resolution events. Okay, so that sort of gives you an example of what the types of challenges I thought we need for such a technique as the detection and attribution. And so my time here is a little bit short, so I just wanted to take a couple slides and show you what we do at NCAR in terms of our initiatives. We have many different types of science we do that fall into these extreme events in terms of the science and attribution, climate attribution, not just in the detection attribution scale, but also in longer time scales. We have many tools that we use. We have climate models, we have global models, we have regional models, and we have basin scale models. So all these different scales that we can look at to solve our problems. And we also have observational instruments and field campaigns and such. And then one of the other things that we're really proud of at NCAR is we have community, and we not only collaborate with our fellow scientists, but we also have initiatives where we are pulling in stakeholders from the community and trying to get them to try to contribute to the types of science that we do. All right, so this is just a quick example of a study that was led by James Doan at NCAR, and this is mapping inland tropical cyclone wind footprints. This study actually, the application of the study is to understand historical losses as stress tests for insurance structures. And so James sort of paired with reinsurance companies. And so what I mean by reinsurance companies is insurance companies that insure insurance companies. So it's reinsurance. But they work together to produce a large data set. I believe it's over 1,000 tropical cyclones that are landfalling. And to have this great database for people to use, and I think institutions such as the World Bank actually applied this type of data. And then finally, this last example is another tropical cyclone example led by Kevin Smiley. Also, Alexandra here today is also part of this study in terms of attributing flooding in southern Louisiana. Now, this is in the US, and we are a developed nation. But there are many places in the U.S. where vulnerable communities exist, such as South Louisiana. So this is an example of a two-pronged approach where we have the physical science, which is basically understanding the science and the attribution of the climate, and that is sort of the first question: who bears the brunt of the climate change attributed flooding impacts? And the second piece is the social piece and how that community reacts to the physical science. So how is climate change attributed flooding interpreted by governance stakeholders and residents? So these are just, again, two quick examples of the types of initiatives we do in terms of climate attribution at NCAR. So here are key points. Science is critical to informing loss and detection and attribution. I've just given you sort of one example of that. There's many other types of climate attribution we can talk about, and maybe we can bring that up in the panel. Detection attribution is actually a really key tool in terms of extreme event attribution. And this is, there are challenges associated with it, as I mentioned, in terms of model bias and timeline and adaptability of framework, et cetera. But it's still a viable tool for us to use. And then this gray box here just is our contact information. So feel free to reach out to us for further discussion. And that is all I have. So I'm now going to queue up Amlan's talk. So I just got to flip through a bunch of extra wonderful slides we have. If anyone has any questions, we can go back to them and then hand it off to Amlan, or I guess our MC first. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for that wonderful presentation and setting a very high bar for me to follow. But good evening, everyone. My name is Amlan. I'm a research associate at the Energy and Resources Institute, and we will be talking more about the governance and finance challenges that arise with the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. So just a brief word about us at TERI. We are an independent multidimensional organization, and we are the oldest sustainability think tank in India, and we work on and we work on cross-cutting topics around climate change. Just a snippet of some of our capabilities around environment, energy, climate, resource efficiency, and security. We also have a pavilion, number 14, in the B6 zone. So please feel free to visit us and learn more about TERI. So I'll quickly jump into the loss and damage challenges. And one of the biggest challenges around loss and damage is that there isn't an established definition for it yet. There has been multiple different definitions for it across the UN bodies and across other think tanks. So in case I'm not audible, please let me know. And so that in itself creates a challenge on where exactly the focus should be, especially when we talk about slow onset and long-term onset and quick onset events, etc. So I'll quickly move on to the components and the estimates of loss and damage. There are economic losses and damages, there are non-economic losses and damages, and while the economic ones can be quantified, even though certain assessments remain challenged, I would say, the non-economic ones are even more difficult to counteract and are possibly even more damaging because they affect our way of life. And there are a lot of estimates around the loss and damage fund. I was hoping to, present some shocking numbers, but now that 400 million has already been pledged by the multiple countries on the first day, I feel my presentation is a bit outdated, but definitely some estimates. Climate Analytics presents it as 400 billion per year by 2030. The Vulnerable 20 group says that there is an economic loss of 525 billion per year for the last 20 years by the vulnerable countries, and UNCTAD asks for an initial capitalization of the fund to be 150 billion per year. So just a quick timeline about loss and damage, and the purpose of this slide is to showcase that just having loss and damage as a topic in itself has been such a challenge, because initially it had been linked to adaptation because of all the issues around liability and responsibility that the developed world felt. And it has been a challenge to establish loss and damage as essentially the third pillar of climate change alongside adaptation and mitigation. And as we have moved on from the Paris Agreement, where this establishment happened, to the establishment of the Santiago Network, and obviously Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, where the final negotiations were taking place. And I'm really glad that I'll be able to add another COP to this timeline. So moving on to the main part of the presentation, the governance challenges around loss and damage. I have basically broken them down into 4 main challenges. The one that I've already talked about, how it should be framed in terms of definition, especially when we talk about it being cited at a fund. And given that it should have an onus on climate justice, given that climate change affects the developing world really, really substantially more than the developed world. And who would benefit from the L&D fund? Is it, as some proposals have put, developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change? The initial US proposal that the fund should be for countries with populations less than 5 million. And when we come to the developing country perspective, who want them to run without any discrimination? These are now questions for the World Bank to face, given that that is where the fund will be cited, but it also has a slightly problematic history of being a lending organization to overcome, as well as addressing the issue that there should be inclusivity and equal representation of the developing countries on how these mechanisms should work. Accordingly, we should also talk about who pays into the fund and whether it should be based on voluntary contributions or linked to emissions, and how does historical emissions play a role into it. Then I would move on to the finance challenges, and we have had so many troubles, and I think one of the biggest hoardings you would see outside at COP is that climate finance, let's solve this issue together. So given that we have had such a challenge meeting the $100 billion target, how do we generate the additional finance into loss and damage without sacrificing our adaptation and mitigation priorities? How should these instruments be generated? Because as the Bridgetown initiative has shown, the concessional lending and the loans framework don't really work, especially when it comes to developing countries getting really affected by the extreme events. And how can we really move towards a grants-based mechanism? Can it move towards insurance? Can it move for debt for relief swaps, etc.? And I'm hoping the panel can draw some insight around that. Lastly, the challenge of fragmentation and reporting. Working in the developing world, one of the major challenges we face when applying to a projects-based model that climate finance today has is the sheer amount of reporting. Now, TERI has been established for a while, and we are able to meet these requirements, but there are a lot of really good ideas to deal with climate change that can't get through this issue of fragmentation. And by creating a loss and damage fund, we should not fall into that trap, especially because how urgently this finance would be needed. Lastly, how should the fund work? And I think this question has sort of been answered with the World Bank, should it be a centralized mechanism? Should it have regional places? How would reporting into such a structure work, etc.? So some basic pointers and some last thoughts that I had around operationalizing the loss and damage fund. Maybe there can be an enhancement of South-South-based research, especially around assessment and resilience science, so that loss and damage science is better informed and assessments are less challenged. Indicator-based triggers, if we are going to stick to our reporting frameworks, maybe certain triggers can be used to channelize the fund to act in a more efficient manner. How do we harness the private sector because of the sheer amount of finances required? And that would be, I think, a challenge that the World Bank would face. That we should not let loss and damage take us away from the long-term focus on adaptation and mitigation, which is an essential need for all of us. The grants-based mechanism or insurance or lending, the instruments. And lastly, the key requirement that there is an inclusivity of the global South, and that they have a voice in both the mobilization and the disbursement of the fund. So with that, I just want to reflect that because the equity and the governance challenges around the loss and damage fund are so new, we hope that there is a lot more work done in the future. But for now, just as a setting up of the issue, we have created a discussion paper around the challenges and opportunities. There are copies at the front of the table, and you can ask any of us at our pavilion for more copies. The download link is here, as well as the QR code, which is also linked to the agendas and is free for you to download. So I'll stop here and let the MC introduce the panelists for the event, and looking forward to hearing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amlan. Reflecting on these presentations, we will now move on to our panel discussion, moderated by Mr. R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow and Program Director at TERI. Mr. Rashmi is a former Special Secretary to the Government of India and was India's principal negotiator for climate change negotiations under the UNFCCC for several years, and has been part of the climate change policy making in India in the run-up to and after the Paris Agreement. We have Dr. Diana Francis, Professor Earth Science and of Earth Sciences at the Khalifa University. Dr. Francis is an internationally renowned atmospheric scientist. She has more than 15 years of experience in academia and scientific research in a wide range of topics, including regional climate and atmospheric dynamics, polar meteorology, aerosol dynamics, and the impacts of ice and ecosystem. We have Dr. Ronnie Abolafia Rosenweik. He is a project scientist at the Research Applications Laboratory at NCAR. His primary research interest is using models and satellite observations to monitor and predict the terrestrial water cycle and its relations to extreme events. We have with us Dr. Joyce Kimutai, scientist at the Kenya Meteorological Services and Imperial College London. Dr. Kimutai is a climate scientist affiliated with the Kenya Meteorological Services and the Grantham Institute of Climate Change, Imperial College. Her research focuses on analyzing the role of anthropogenic climate change in extreme weather and climate events to raise climate risk awareness and inform policy. We also have with us today Dr. Anand Patwardhan, professor at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on mitigation and adaptation responses to climate change and the assessment of vulnerability and adaptation, as well as the broader issues of climate technology and innovative policy. We also have with us Mr. Harjeet Singh, Head of Global Political Strategy, Climate Action Network International. Mr. Singh is a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, mitigation, adaptation, and he has been supporting countries across the world on tackling climate change. Until recently, he has led ActionAid International's climate change work globally. He is also a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw Mechanism, International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Thank you, panel. Mr. Rashmi, over to you. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We have with us Dr. Benito Mueller, Managing Director, Oxford Climate Policy. Professor Mueller is the Managing Director of Oxford Climate Policy and the Director of the European Capacity Building Initiative, which is an international initiative for sustained capacity building in support of international climate change negotiation. Welcome, panels. Mr. Rashmi, over to you.
Thank you. Why don't you give me thank you, Ashmita, and welcome everyone to this extremely exciting subject. Initially, the plan was that I will stand here and all the panelists will sit here, but an additional chair is there, so now there is no problem. So let me now straight away go into the subject matter, which my colleagues in TERI have so beautifully, and the representative from National Center for Atmospheric Resource, they have outlined. Now, there are three questions which broadly summarize the issues. Who pays into the fund? Who gets covered? Who gets covered in the fund? And how do we estimate the losses? These are broadly the three questions that I will request the panelists to address. These are all tricky issues. Absolutely, there is no doubt that we should complement the presidency and all the stakeholders and all the governments and the various stakeholders who have agreed on operationalizing the loss and damage fund, and we have kick-started the fund here. So a round of applause for them. So the next question automatically is then the first person I'll be inviting. We have Mr. Harjeet Singh. He's the good thing is that amongst the 6 panelists that we have a range of people representing a cross-section of views. We have Mr. Singh, who represents the civil society and the climate actions. We have Dr. Patwardhan, who represents the science part of the adaptation vulnerability. He has a long track record in researching on the subject. Dr. Benito Mueller is a professor at Oxford, and he runs a capacity building initiative at Oxford, and he has dealt with this issue of financing climate finance and loss and damage in particular for a long time. So I'm sure we'll hear some good insights from him. And then, of course, we have the 3 scientists from NCAR, and so we will get to know the scientific perspective of how to deal with this issue of estimation and attribution. So let me now invite you, Harjeet, first. Considering the fact that the fund has now been put into so-called, almost it has started taking baby steps here and it has started running. So how do you see this issue of issue of loss and damage fund? Are you happy with it? And do you think there are still some gaps which need to be addressed, and what are the challenges ahead?
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashmi, for having me, and TERI for organizing this event. And somehow the timing is very interesting. Just yesterday we got it, and today we are getting a chance to discuss it threadbare. If you ask me, I'm happy. Probably happy is not the right word, but I'm relieved because this fight has been going on for the last 30 years, and we were holding our breath. We are not pleased with the overall outcome. There are so many gaps in what we got so far, but at least we were able to get over the line. And what we got at COP27 was the political recognition of the reality that loss and damage is here, and this system did not have any mechanism to deal with it. And that's what we agreed. And had we not reached a point where we are now operationalizing the fund, that would have been just a political statement or a wish to do something. And that's exactly the reason compromises were made, whether it is for the World Bank to host the fund, or some of the questions that remain unaddressed or partially addressed. And eligibility is one such question, as you asked. Of course, the language that we got at COP27 was all countries that are particularly vulnerable. And if you go by the real text, all countries are particularly vulnerable. So technically, all developing countries are eligible. And that's absolutely fine. The push that was coming from developed countries was to narrow it down to LDCs, least developed countries, and small island states. And this is something that we need to really understand. Small island states, yes, there is no dispute around their vulnerability. We know they are highly vulnerable, and priority should be given to them to some extent. But when it comes to least developed countries, I think Bhutan just a few days ago got out of that list this month. Bhutan is no more an LDC. Bangladesh and Nepal are going to be out of the LDC list. I'm talking about 3 countries from my own region. I come from India, I'm talking of South Asia. In November 2026, do you think they are going to be less vulnerable by then? Or Bhutan, anything happens to Bhutan now, would not have been eligible. That was the fight. So it's a dynamic list that we were dealing with. So that's why when developing countries kept saying that all countries need to be eligible, this factor also was playing, right? So where we are heading right now, we've got that question of eligibility. However, we also recognize that there are some countries more vulnerable than others in the large group of developing countries. So what we need to work now on is the prioritization. That's why the Loss and Damage Fund Board is going to look at the resource allocation framework, which may look into some of these issues of kind of impacts they are facing, or the impacts they are going to have in future, what kind of triggers that we need to be looking at, scale of impacts, and their capacity to overcome. Those things are then going to be used to determine the resource allocation framework. So just to respond to your question, we have got something in terms of eligibility. There are many more things that are going to be unpacked. Again, even in terms of who's going to give the money, we've got developed countries taking a lead, but it's wide open. Voluntary contributions are welcome. But we know that's not going to be enough. We need to have an obligation-based system. So the fight continues. So the overall outcome, if you ask me, I would say that we've got this fund, and there are a lot of things that we need to now work on, which would definitely require scientific inputs in terms of working on some of these frameworks and metrics, but at the same time, a strong implementation system to make sure that money reaches people who it is intended for. I think some of those things need to be emphasized. Yeah, I'm happy to respond to other questions if they are.
Thank you, Arjit. Thank you. That was quite useful. You have made 2 very important points that, in your view and the view of the civil society in general, all countries are eligible for the support from the fund, and of course there has to be prioritization. So that leads to the next question, which I'll pose to Dr. Patwardhan. If that is so, if the needs have to be prioritized, then what kind of framework can we apply here? I mean, you have researched so much on the adaptation and vulnerability issue. So what is, from your science and research perspective, what is the way forward here?
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashmi, and this is really a most opportune moment to be having this conversation. So let me start by saying that the conventional project cycle will not work. So I think that's quite obvious. The whole concept of loss and damage is speed and automaticity. So if you are going to, unless we do that, in a sense, the whole purpose gets negated if we have to go through a science process of establishing attribution and then a project cycle process of whether it's the, now it's not the Green Climate Fund, but if you get something like a conventional project cycle that the Loss and Damage Fund will operate, that will kind of make the whole purpose quite infructuous, which means you need to move from sort of ex post to ex ante, almost like the kind of move we had for forecast-based finance. So if you look at the model of forecast-based finance, where you have triggers, and I like the comment that was made by our colleague from TERI about indicators and triggers, but you need to have a modality of that kind, which will provide for automaticity and triggers. Related to that is my concern that, and we have seen this in the case of the GCF, that the climate rationale has been used essentially as a means for, even if there's money in the barrel, to basically turn the tap off so that very little flows out of it. And my worry is that climate attribution will become, for the Loss and Damage Fund, what the climate rationale has been for the adaptation funding, where if you set too high a bar, that again makes the whole purpose somewhat infructuous. The final point, I guess, just two other quick points. I very much like Harjeet's reminder of us that in some ways loss and damage is experienced by people. So even as we talk of countries, we have to understand that money has to get to people who have experienced that loss and damage. So again, the question of access and delivery becomes very critical, right? And we have seen the limitations of that in adaptation finance. And what that means is, when vulnerability is tied to people and communities, is there has to be a very different notion of how we think about eligibility. And then I guess my final point is, even though loss and damage and adaptation are distinct pillars, they are conceptually part of the portfolio of risk management, of how we think about managing risk. So in some ways, the term unabated fossil fuels has sort of entered our lexicon. Maybe the term unadapted loss and damage should also enter our lexicon in some manner. So I just leave that thought for you. Thanks.
That was an interesting point, Dr. Patwardhan, on which you stopped. 3 points which you made are extremely relevant. You said project-based cycle will not work, and we have to go forward to forecast-based financing based on some indicators, some triggers. And obviously, we have to define vulnerability at the community and the people level. And lastly, of course, we have to link adaptation and loss and damage. They're extensions of the same phenomenon, but we have to look at it differently, but it's a continuum. So that takes me forward to Dr. Miller. He has contributed so much in building capacity at various levels, and particularly contributing to the idea of climate finance, and loss and damage is now one specific dimension of that. So Dr. Miller, how do you look at this, considering this debate about who should pay, who should not pay, who should get covered?
Well, one thing, thank you, Rashmiji. One thing which I definitely don't know nothing about is attribution. So I will not, that's Miles Allen, I will not talk about that, okay? I worked on climate finance for many, many years, as was said. When I was in Sharm el-Sheikh, I did not actually expect the fund to be established. And the moment it was established, I had two worries. One is it's going to be a placebo fund, as I used to call it, and the other one, a siphon fund. What does that mean? Well, placebo is obvious. You know, everyone is happy, but no money. The siphon fund is, all right, there is money, but it's taken away from the other funds. Not an acceptable scenario either. We have to understand there is not a lot of loose cash around in government budgets, even in the north, okay? So those are, now we have 400 million, it's still quite small, huh? And it's only a one-off. So what I started talking about in 2006 was innovative finance, which goes beyond contributions by governments through budget allocations. One of them was the airline levy, ticket levy, which was, we took from the French. They have it for HIV/AIDS. They actually got it running in 2006, and it works. It works, it has proven to work, there's no, and so what we have, with Samuel Haq, who very sadly passed away a few weeks ago, we did this, we revived it in the context of loss and damage finance, and we called it sort of climate solidarity levies. We will have, here's a plug, we will have a side event on the 8th of December, CARICOM Pavilion, 5:30, with drinks afterwards, just to and what we're looking at here is charges. You know, we don't want to call it taxes, but basically instead of going for global agreements, a global agreement on a global tax, which is never going to happen, I'm afraid, or it would take a long time. Let's just do, if you're interested in doing this, let's do it just voluntarily as a country, at home. Have an alliance of countries who can do it, and just join in now, right? And these levies, they have to be A, simple to collect. Everyone has air ticket charges. We could also have container charges, $10 per container, things like that. But they have to be, they have to flow into a separate fund, not into the general budget, because the moment it's in the general budget, it's lost. And then it can be channeled to the loss and damage fund, amongst other things. So this we'll discuss at this side event. And in terms of eligibility, I don't want, this is a very political thing, okay? And I have no, how you define who is eligible. At the moment, we have no real definition of who is eligible for the GCF. We know developing countries, but who says what is a developing country? I think this, sometimes we have to be, just work with what we got, loose definitions, and see what happens, okay? We have a new report which just came out. You can go to the ecbi.org, and it's called, wait for it, Loss and Damage Pilot Funding Arrangements. Here, the reason why I'm saying pilot funding arrangements is that's what I see this fund is going to do. I do not see this as a fund which spends 150 billion annually. It's very difficult to spend 150 billion annually. What this fund should do to start up with is to pilot new funding arrangements, for example, but also new ways of spending the money. Insurance, new insurance schemes. Many countries, I'm told, from the private insurance sector, they wouldn't touch with a barge pole because they don't have the right information and stuff. So why not have this fund help countries to become insurable? Stuff like that. Sort of very concrete, but not the only channel of this money, loss and damage money, right? So if you want to have a look at that. And the other one is a blog post about access modalities. That's very, I've become very pedestrian in my sort of view. I want things which actually happen now. One of the problems, I was involved in setting up in an advisory capacity for the LDC, the Green Climate Fund. I think one of the problems we have there is actually the sort of project pipeline, micromanagement of the board, I'm afraid to say. And these sort of things we have to avoid. And the only way we can avoid that is if we go to devolved programmatic access, to enhance direct access, these sort of modalities where the decisions are done at the country level and not necessarily in capital, actually at the local level. And if it's pre-arranged grants, insurance, yeah, then you have criteria, and here you pay. I mean, this is, this in my mind is the key thing which we have to add to in addition to the governing instruments, which is basically we want to have maybe one country program, because you don't want to have 100 programs which compete with each other. So each country has a loss and damage funding program which is funded for that from the fund, and they can pilot stuff, innovative new things, which then the rest of the environment, that whole what's it called, ecosystem, that's a good word, no? Can then adopt, because usually these other guys are not in there for piloting. So that would be my thing about what this fund is to do, is literally help to create new innovative out-of-the-box thinking for this fund. Thank you.
Dr. Mueller, thank you very much. You have referred to the climate solidarity levies, which has been there on the table for quite some time. It will be interesting to hear what you have to say on 8th about these new instruments, but new ways of spending the money or new ways of funding the arrangements are absolutely necessary. And most importantly, the point that you raised was about how to access the funds, enhanced direct access of the stakeholders. That's critical for effective use of the resources, if and when they are mobilized. So let me now go to Dr. Diana Francis. She's a professor of the earth sciences. So my question to her would be, we heard about this attribution science, and see, considering the problems with the climate modeling, which we all know, to what extent do you think this will be an effective way of estimating the losses or predicting the losses and actually, supporting the people who are affected?
Thank you for this event, and thank you for the question as well. So I think as a scientific community, we do have...
Closer to the mic, I think.
Sorry. Can you hear me? As scientific community, I think we do have great tools to support the loss and damage process as a whole, starting from the warning of an extreme event that is going to happen, to predicting the loss and damage, and then to quantifying it after the event happens. If we can start with the prediction of the severe weather, let's say, because at the end these are the actual weather systems that are going to cause the damage and the loss for the countries. So the current models are actually able to provide this information maybe a few days in advance, in addition to the information that can be provided from Earth observations, so satellite. Once these events happen, to assess the loss and the damage that is caused, we rely heavily on the Earth observation, because we can actually compare what was the situation before the event and what is the situation after the event. So we can estimate the area that was damaged, and knowing all the information that about what was in this area, we can get into the estimation of the amounts, the infrastructure that was damaged, and how this will cost to rebuild, for instance. So I think in order to have accurate information about the quantification of the loss and damage, the contribution from the scientific community is really critical, because they do understand the tools and they know how to apply them for this question of loss and damage.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Francis, for your short comments. I'll come back to you on this issue of attribution once again in the second round if we have time.
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt and disrupt your flow. I actually have to leave in 5 minutes, and I want to make 2 quick comments if you allow me. I'm sorry, I don't like doing it.
On attribution or something else?
It's on attribution and as well as what Benito said.
Please.
I'm sorry. On attribution, there's no doubt, and especially we as climate justice advocates, it has been extremely useful. As the debate was progressing and questions were being asked, how can you say that these losses and damages are because of climate change? that attribution science was extremely handy. But I think the issue has evolved a lot more, and especially when we saw floods in Pakistan. And there are studies on looking at their water channels and water management systems, which were built by British. And even Americans had a say in that at some point in time. I think the question that we need to be asking when we look at attribution, and this is more of a request to the research and scientific community, that we have to start combining those two as well. Because it's very clear, I'm sure you must be aware that there was a report by Carbon Brief, because of which India's ranking in cumulative emissions has changed from 7th to 8th, and UK, which was 8th, is now at number 5, if you take into account colonial emissions. It's a very recent report. Another thing that we need to be taking into account, that what colonization did to us. And again, India's case was highlighted a lot more a few years ago. And when I say India, it's a subcontinent. It was 1/4 of the world's economy when British came to India. And when they left us, we were 3% of the world's economy. And there's a figure of $44 trillion that is due to India, which British took away. Now, what it did to us, it was not just a number. If it affected us in terms of economic resources, it also has an impact on our natural resources, on our ability, on our capacity. So now when we face disasters, and I'm saying India, I mean Nepal, I mean Bangladesh, Pakistan, right? Which means if now they have less capacity and the intensity and frequency of disasters are increasing, and if you only look at the increased intensity as part of attribution and not the reduced capacity over the last few decades and centuries, I think attribution science is only showing half of the story. So this is my plea to the scientific community to look at attribution in a much wider context than just looking at it from the climate dimension. And my second point, which is to Benito, I know you don't want it to be a debate, and probably it will not be because I'm going to be leaving and I can have a debate with Benito later. I'm actually surprised, Benito, that at this moment you are talking about insurance. When we know that insurance is failing in countries where it has been a big thing. Pick up a report 2 months ago from the US. It says places in the US are becoming uninsurable because of climate change. It's a headline. In UK, floods. Insurance? It doesn't work in case of slow onset events. Sea level rise. There's a recent report which talks about how sea level rise is increasing. WMO report on 29th. What is it saying? No, unprecedented. So insurance is not going to work on slow onset event because the whole business is based on probability. Extreme weather events are becoming so extreme and so frequent, their business models are collapsing. Collapse is the word for the insurance industry. And that's why this is one such industry which has been engaged in these conversations right from the day one. Forget about climate. I come from disaster sector. You find them there because it's a business for them. Their business model is collapsing. And we are talking about giving insurance industry more access to developing countries for what? We know that when we talk of developing countries, we are talking about poor people who are financially illiterate, who cannot get those claims. Even now, when you look at the number of these claims, and I have been asking this question for years now to senior officials from this industry, they have not been able to respond to my questions. You tell me whether your payout has been able to help people recover and what percentage of recovery. Ask these questions. I'm giving you these questions. Ask them. They will talk about their business model is not going to work for people who are poor. It's also a justice issue. Who's going to pay the premium? Governments or people? I think there are much bigger questions about the insurance industry which is failing right now, crumbling in front of us. And we can't rely on that. And innovative sources of finance. Some of us also have been advocating for it for a very long time. Again, recent example. French, to be fair to them, they said they're going to champion the whole shipping levy. They said that even in the transitional committee, for this very conversation. And we also took that in the positive spirit. They tried, genuinely they tried. In the Paris finance discussion, what happened? They said they're going to take it to the IMO. International Maritime Organization, which met in July. What did it say? It said, you know what, we are not ready to tax, and if at all we do it, we are going to use that money to green our own industry. So why we fought for loss and damage fund and not agree to funding arrangements? Because funding arrangements, which this is part of, is outside this business. UNFCCC has no control over IMO. And many of these, IKO, we can't dictate terms. We can go influence, yes, and I'm all for it. If that money comes, which can complement public finance, great. And it also helps in, in more, what you call it, automaticity, right? That's what we need. So it's a good thing. I'm not denying that option, and I'm not saying I'm not ruling that out. But we need to understand the limitation and not over-rely on an option which, by evidence, is failing or is not going to be good enough to raise this money. And we are into serious business now, friends. We have got the fund. We have to make sure it is fit for purpose. I'm sorry for disrupting the flow and speaking.
Thank you, Harjit. Actually, to come back to you, in any case, you have made your points again, and that was really an interesting perspective on this. So maybe if you leave early, you will be depriving the audience of an opportunity to come back to you with some more interesting questions.
Just one sentence. You really have to come to our side event, okay?
Okay, maybe we will discuss this. Let me invite Dr. Ronnie Rosenzweig. Now, you are also a scientist, so this business of attribution, can you explain a little more? Because you have heard 2 points of view that only science cannot do the attribution. You have to look at the other historical, political, social, economic factors also. So how do you see this again?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So my expertise are in the water cycle over land surfaces, so I'll speak to that, although the perspectives which Mr. Harjit shared are extremely important to account for in the research that we conduct, and I'm very appreciative of you bringing up these topics, and they're going to be important to keep in mind as we continue with this attribution research. So we need to develop a deep and employ a deep understanding of the water cycle within a rapidly changing climate. And this is really essential to be able to discriminate between the impacts of natural variability versus human-caused climate change on these extreme events. And this requires the advanced models which we have, but it also requires observations in the areas that we're applying these models. And unfortunately, in the areas that are going to be most impacted by climate change, particularly through the water cycle, these are typically undergauged regions or regions that don't have dense networks of observations that can observe the water cycle, which is essential to essentially validate the models that we use to do this attribution research. And again, the goal here is to look at different extreme events, for example, drought. There's been some recent attribution research looking at different forms of drought. Flash drought, which is this rapid intensification of drought that now the globe is seeing an increasing trend in. And a lot of this increasing trend has been attributed to climate change using these models. And then there's these mega droughts, which are these multi-year, even multi-decade droughts. And again, looking at southwestern North America and Chile and Argentina, the ongoing mega droughts, a lot of these ongoing mega droughts, the severity of them has been attributed to climate change in between 20 to 50% of the severity. And then the areas that will be experiencing these types of droughts, flash droughts and mega droughts in the future, will likely be intensified by climate change, depicted by the historical records from observations as well as these models. But to be able to provide a precise number on the discrimination between the impacts of the natural variability versus the impacts from climate change on these hydrologic extremes, we need observations, and that requires funding of the monitoring in these areas that are going to be most impacted, and particularly in the context of the loss and damage.
Right. Thank you very much. We have now Dr. Joyce Kimutai. Dr. Kimutai, you are not only a scientist but also a lead negotiator on behalf of Kenya. So it will be interesting to hear from you, because you combine the experience of having looked at this process from both sides, as a scientist, as a negotiator, and now as a panelist on this issue. So how do you see this whole issue of loss and damage evolving from all these perspectives?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be here today to speak about loss and damage, operationalizing it, and with equity and efficacy. It's an important topic to talk about. So I am a climate scientist. I do attribution science. That's really the thing that I've done for a long time. I work with the World Meteorological Organization, World Weather Attribution, and what we do at WWA is respond to extreme events when they happen, because we want to communicate the role of climate change when it's really still in people's mouth. So we want to talk to policymakers about the way these events are changing. So early this year, Christine, the presentation you made today, there's a paper you shared on saying attribution science is ready for loss and damage. So it's actually to a response to a paper that we published early this year saying that it's not ready. And the reason why we said it's not ready is because of the ethical issues that applying attribution science to operationalize the fund would really raise. And because I'm also leading a paper now that we are sort of like unpacking and saying, what do we mean? Why we say it's not ready, and what does it mean? And then in that paper, we're talking about navigating the complex relationships between attribution science and loss and damage. And the reason why I am doing this is because I've participated in this policy as well as, as a negotiator from Kenya, negotiating for Kenya on this. And as a scientist, and I could see how issues around operationalizing the fund, using the science to actually support the loss and damage debate wasn't going in a way that I thought as a scientist was just. And one of the reasons for this is, so first to say is that it's indisputable that the science of attribution, which is understanding the role of climate change, has provided compelling evidence to say that extreme events are changing, adaptation's limits are reached, we're seeing losses and damages, and really need support, as vulnerable nations or developing nations to address these losses and damages. And so in that regard, what's really interesting is that at the moment, we can measure the losses and the impacts of these extreme events in all parts of the world in the same way. So there is the sort of the information that is not available at all scale. And that is also with attribution science. So we can do attribution science across the world in a way that can support loss and damage in a just way. So there's an ethical issue to that. But most importantly, we are not saying the science is useless. So we are saying that there's a role that the science can play, but there's the limit to which the science can actually play a role in this process. So before he left, he talked about the limitations of the science at the moment. And he's just talking about, so he mentioned that on the climate side of things, that could just be one side of the story. So I think an interesting thing that we've done, even at World Weather Attribution now, is that we're trying to bring in elements of vulnerability and exposure and trying to combine with the science. So we're sort of giving an holistic understanding of what is actually happening. Because the impacts that people experience on the ground is really moderated by their vulnerability and exposure. So it's really important to understand, like, okay, there's the role of the climate in this. There are the impacts. There's the sort of the warming of the planet that is causing the kind of intensities and the frequencies of extreme events. But how is the situation on the ground is what we also need to understand. And that is actually what causes the impact. So we think the science can support that. But I think before I close, I think moving forward is that it's really important to have loss and damage as part of the global stocktake, because then we'll have regular reviews of what is required to address the impacts. And at the same time, we want to say that the uncertainties and inequities in the cost and impacts of extreme events across different classes of events and different regions it makes it really hard to determine how much, what is the size of the fund, how much do the people require, who requires this. So we think the science is important in designing the fund, designing this fund. It's really important to see what the science can say and help us design. And an important example in which the science can help in that designing is ballparking sort of the needs, the financial needs. So when we talk about sort of that, developing that resource allocation framework, we want to say, what does the science tell us about sort of the estimates of the costs? And in that, we don't want, and on eligibility, we are saying that we don't want to use the science. It's not a just mechanism to use the science to determine eligibility, because you can't do the science equally in all parts of the world. So for example, a flooding in Rwanda or DRC, you're not able to say if climate change played a role. Not because you don't understand the science, because you don't have the tools to do that. So you don't have the models are not doing the right thing. You don't have the data to understand that. And so it's not really a scientific reason, but it's just a data issue. So it's not a just mechanism to use. So, but then we can say, if we really understand that extreme rainfall, for example, is increasing and the science is clear, and we have a physical strong understanding that this is actually happening, that we can use that to ballpark and see what are sort of the estimates of the needs that we require to address the funding. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was quite an interesting and eye-opening perspective. Before I invite questions from the audience, I just have one or two short questions to the panelists. Dr. Francis, you have just heard Dr. Kim Uthai. She said that it's not possible to do this attribution equally in all parts of the world in a similar fashion. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I completely understand this point, and actually, Ronnie mentioned already that we need actually more data in the vulnerable regions. That now, for instance, these tools were developed in areas where we have a lot of data already existing. So it's a good starting point to develop them where the data is available. But having data in, the most vulnerable areas is really important things to actually request, maybe under this initiative as well. Because we have to start from the attribution, a just attribution, so meaning we have to have data to do this. So this is very important. Not only data at the ground, but also there are a lot of data that is available from satellites, for instance, but are not accessible to scientific communities still in some areas. So this is again something that needs to be open to the scientific community, so they can actually access at least the data that is available from space.
Okay. Dr. Rosenzieg, you have any supplement, any additional point to what she has just said? This point about just attribution, that the data not being adequate, how do you generate adequate data and how do you respond to this? Any additional point on this you have?
Yeah, I agree with the point that we do need more data in these regions that are going to be disproportionately impacted. We're doing a lot of work to be able to develop tools and data sets over these areas using what is applicable. These are models of the Earth system which rely on physical principles and satellite observations over these areas, but without a grounding of observations on the ground specifically, there's going to be larger uncertainty in these estimates that we provide. And that's going to be important in this discrimination between the natural variability like El Nino, La Nina versus the climate change impacts on the events that we're looking to at the attribution research for. So if the larger the uncertainty on our estimates are, the more difficult it is to make that discrimination as accurately as possible.
Okay. Dr. Francis, time permitting, I'll come back to you. Let me go to Dr. Patwardhan first. Considering this issue of inadequacy of data, uncertainty in the data, what is the immediate, because now the fund has to start working. How do you think this can happen?
So I think I just want to pick up on something that Dr. Kimutai said, which is really important, which is what are we attributing? Are we attributing event characteristics or are we attributing loss and damage? If it's the former, I think the science is on much firmer ground, even though there are clearly data limitations. And if it's the latter, then the situation is much worse because now you're looking at attributing socioeconomic outcomes. And at that point, you get into the entire complexity that Harjeet also mentioned and Dr. Kimutai also mentioned about exposure and vulnerability. And specifically risk management decisions that may or may not have been taken, which will affect what the actual socioeconomic outcomes were. So I think you need to sort of, as you start looking now at the fund, you need to separate the question of eligibility, which is which events qualify, so to speak, where you can have a more clear scientific rationale from potentially, how much is the finance that flows, let's say, as a part of the loss and damage question, because there you really are starting to look at socioeconomic outcomes, where it's a much more complex problem, and this comes, I think, much more critically in the case of slow onset versus acute onset, because in slow onset events you have much greater predictability of the future sequence of losses that might be experienced based on how exposure and vulnerability might evolve.
So let me also comment something on that. I also think that it's really important if we can't, it's important to sort of, if the standards are set too low, for example, and say that we can use the science to sort of even not use it at all, even in the scoping. To me, it's really important to use the science in the scoping. Because if you don't use the science in the scoping, there's the risk that there will be so much requests, too many requests, and that will disadvantage vulnerable communities. So we want to say, who is vulnerable?
Right.
What is the science telling us?
Right.
What do we mean by, so what countries? So and I like the point that Achal mentioned initially, saying that some countries like Nepal now are not LDCs. Kenya, for example, is not LDC anymore.
Right. So we have to define this.
Yeah.
Dr. Kimutai, sorry for interrupting you, because now we have to really open this entire business for questioning by the audience. We have two hands here. Dr. Suresh Badwal, yes.
It links to the point that Dr. Patwardhan was just making. I was thinking it's just not limited to the science connecting to the decision with regard to the operation of the fund, because there would be huge issues with regards to the capacities of scientists in the developing world with regard to such assessments. And then it raises the big issue for me on trust, and why do we trust people or institutions who are doing the attribution studies to be able to dictate how the fund flows. So there is a larger question which is sitting behind, and therefore either you focus on building capacities across countries with regards to this area of work, and then come on an equal platform to be able to talk about how this fund basically should flow and how it should be operationalized with regards to who receives and who benefits.
Okay, that was a comment. There was a question here. Yes, sir. But before that, there is a gentleman behind.
Thank you all.
Kindly identify yourself and mention.
Sure, yeah, I'm Jonathan Kim. I'm from Indiana University. I am curious about leaning on attribution science for developing the loss and damage fund and how it's distributed. Attribution science kind of lends itself to integrated assessment models, things that can be quantified. Is using attribution science inherently in tension with non-economic losses, particularly things that some non-economic losses can be quantified in certain ways, right? There's economic research behind that, but things like culture, things like heritage sites, there's nothing really there to try and quantify those. Are those things inherently in tension, or is there a way to resolve it? Do you see a path forward to kind of both use the attribution science and these kind of non-economic factors?
Okay, another question, sir.
Well, thank you all very much for this very illuminating conversation. My name is Ian Hitchcock. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student from Duke University in the United States. I just very briefly want to say that as someone from the US, having the opportunity to hear directly from those of you that are on the global front lines of the climate crisis is a very powerful and meaningful experience for me, and I so appreciate that. My question pertains to the kind of limitations of a voluntary mechanism for operationalizing loss and damage. I worry a lot that with the incentive structures in play of people wanting to put out, positive press releases and create a narrative of progress, that these sorts of processes create a lot of overheated rhetoric, while the reality of sharing the resources doesn't actually manifest. So are there limitations to the voluntary mechanism, and are there means of coming up with other mechanisms to try to steer investments from more developed parts of the world to the places that need it the most?
Maybe your question, I'll request Dr. Patwardhan to respond. Yes, I'll come back to you. Dr. Patwardhan, to this question of culture, other non-economic losses, how do you quantify?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think this is why maybe this, as I was saying earlier, the separation between event attribution and loss and damage attribution becomes important, because I think as you start getting into actually what are the impacts being experienced, then you really unfold the whole spectrum of loss, which includes tangible, intangible, and monetizable, non-monetizable. The one thing interesting to keep in mind that most of the standard databases of say what the Catholic University of Louvain maintains, the Research and Epidemiology of Disasters, most of the disaster loss databases only count insured loss. Now, obviously, that is right on the face of it is a huge limitation, because there are no that's in the developing world, you don't have insurance markets, and the losses that are being experienced are vastly greater than whatever insured losses can capture. So right there, you have a very basic, even on the monetizable economic losses, you have some huge limitations in terms of what you are measuring. And I think to your point on intangible, that is obviously a really big question.
Sorry, Giancarlo, be aware that you only have 7 minutes for ending the session, and we have the next session.
Yeah, we just close it. The last question on this limitation of the voluntary mechanisms, Dr. Mueller, do you have any thoughts? Are there any other ways?
Are there any what?
Other ways of...
No, I mean, the voluntary mechanism is basically to get things going now, as opposed to wait for 20 years until we negotiate some global thing, okay? And about using attribution science, I think Anand mentioned something initially about the sort of the bedevilment, about the dividing between development and adaptation. Let's not get too hung up about what percentage of losses and damages are climate-induced, okay? Because by and large, what was it, 16 billion in Bangladesh, no, in Pakistan for the flood, even if it's only 15 or 10% climate-induced, it's still more than we can actually transfer, okay? So let's not get too hung up about what the certainty of the attribution and all that sort of stuff is. We need money and we need to fund these things. That is the main thing. And in terms of insurance, I never try to actually say insurance is the only tool. No, this fund should actually pilot tools and maybe new insurance tools, right? That's the whole point.
So thank you very much. With this, because we have been told to wind up now, with this I must thank all the panelists and all of you for being patient with us. For an extremely exciting and interesting discussion on a very important and rather controversial and debatable subject. But there are different dimensions here. People look at the whole issue of, who should generate resources, and what are the modalities of estimating the actual impacts very differently. And sometimes the truth lies in every single perspective. There's not one perspective which captures the entire truth. So let me thank all the panelists once again for enlightening us and showing us some way forward. I'm sure we will capture this in our brief when we prepare this. And once again, thank you for being patient, being here.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you to Mr. Rashmi. We now close with a word of thanks from Dr. Alexandra Ramos-Valle, scientist at NCAR.
Yeah, thank you so much to our speakers and panelists for providing such broad perspectives on this topic and really considerations for implementing the Loss and Damage Fund from a scientific, governance, and financial lenses. On behalf of NCAR, I want to thank TERI, our co-organizers of this event, and obviously a special thanks to all our panelists and for everyone for joining us today. Some of the NCAR folks are going to be outside the room if you want to have a chat with us, so we'll stay behind for a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Our policy briefs are on the chair over there in case anyone wants to pick it up. We request everyone to exit from this door to the back, and anyone having headphones, headsets, to return them at the table at the entry. Thank you and have a good evening.